Welcome to How to Edit in Audacity. Now, prior to watching this video, you should have read 3 things on the document that this is attached to. Well, watched actually I should say. The first thing you should have watched is the 30-minute video on the basics of how to edit, how to use, how to download Audacity, which we will not be covering here, so that'll be really helpful so you understand what I'm actually doing when I'm making these edits in this video. You should have also downloaded the linked tracks on the page as well, which includes both vocal tracks we'll be editing today, along with the intro and outro music. And finally, you should have read the basic list of problems that I see when I am listening to these 2 tracks that I recorded. Now, knowing that having those problems in mind will give you a good priming for what we're looking for here in our editing. So let me go ahead and show you how we start this off. So I've got already my Audacity open and I've got 2 tracks created. Now, this isn't actually strictly necessary. You want to have tracks open, obviously, if you're editing, but in order to edit something on a track, you're going to have to record into it. In our case, we already have 2 pre-recorded tracks, so what we're going to do instead, nice and easy, is just go ahead and drag and drop both of them in there. Perfect. So before we do anything else, let me go over what we're going to be doing here. The first thing we're going to be doing is adding effects, and that's in order to make our speakers sound nice and loud without overpowering the speaker. Following that, we're going to be making sure that our introduction more or less works, that the way that people are speaking lines up and feels like a natural conversation. Then we'll be adding music before finally going into general edits to make sure that we remove ums, ands, restarts, etc., etc. Before finally dropping in the outro music. And at that point, you'll have a basic idea of what we're doing here. Almost everything I'm going to be talking about is more or less going to be what we generally want to do. However, there are certain things we'll come across which you'll see are kind of a matter of personal preference. But we'll get to that when it comes up. So the first thing we want to pay attention to here is the effects. Now, the effects are what make us sound good to a certain degree. Bigger, more invested podcasts might use EQ, which actually modify the character of the speaker's voices, but for our purpose, we're going to keep it nice and simple. We're just going to be adding a noise gate, a compressor. Well, actually, we'll skip the compressor for now because in this case, we actually don't need it. And then we'll be adding a loudness normalizer. So just for now, noise gate and a loudness normalizer. Now, why are we paying attention to these things? Well, let me go ahead and see if I can show you why we want to start off with a noise gate. And just to recap, if you don't remember exactly what we covered in the document, a noise gate keeps out all noises from being heard under a certain decibel level. So pay attention to this bar up here. This is going to be the decibel level we're seeing on the tracks we're playing. Now, this will be helpful because sometimes if you don't have headphones, this can be a little bit difficult to hear. Now, I don't know if you heard that. Let me play it one more time. So what you're hearing there is some background noises. I make a little sound with my mouth. You can also hear my desktop, and it maxes out around, I'm going to say that is maybe -50, -51 decibels. So what we're going to want to do is go on ahead and throw in a noise gate. So we're going to select the track using this bar up here, clicking Effect, and going all the way down here to noise gate. For our purposes, I think the default settings are more or less going to be okay. I'm actually, the default gate threshold of -40, I'm going to bump down to let's call it -45, just to be safe, because we don't want it to cut off the sound of our voice. So we want to make sure that we're only getting just below the background noises that we want to remove. And let's go ahead and solo the bottom track so we can make sure we are only hearing the bottom stuff. And it looks like the noises down there are also maxing out around -50 or -51. So we're going to go ahead and do the same thing down there. And set that to -45, which it is helpfully remembered for us. And now when we listen to it, it should be completely silent. Nothing even registers. And I start speaking, and you can see that it has started registering. So perfect. Now we can, when one of us isn't speaking, you don't have to hear background noises. Now there are 2 other ways you could go about doing this. The first is using a noise subtractor. However, I feel like in general that's not as useful as just throwing on a noise gate, unless you have some particular circumstances, but again, that's up to personal preference. If that's something you're interested in pursuing, we can talk about that. Now, you can also go ahead and just, whenever anyone's not talking, just fully delete that track. I do that in some of my own editing, I will say, just to be absolutely certain. However, that being said, that's a really labor-intensive process, and you may not necessarily find it worthwhile when a noise gate can do roughly the same thing. Okay, so that's a noise gate. Now let's go ahead and normalize these two tracks. Now, what do I mean by normalizing? Well, so a decibel isn't actually, technically speaking, a measurement of how loud something is. It's a measurement of electrical frequency. What we're looking at here, all recordings essentially are just electrical frequency. A microphone takes your voice, turns it into vibrations. Well, your voice starts out as vibrations, but then it gets turned into an electrical signal, which is then turned into ones and zeros by audio processors, which then gets sent into your computer. So what we're looking at here is not a voice per se, but electrical signals representing that voice. So what I mean by that is that sometimes subjective loudness, how we hear things, may differ from pure decibels. Now, this is getting into something called loudness units, which is represented by either LU or LUFS, and that's a measurement which attempts to understand the subjective loudness of something. So loudness normalization, in our case, is the attempt to make this sound, both tracks, in this case, sound like they are or were recorded at roughly the same level. So there's two speakers, even if they maybe weren't speaking at the same volume, which in this case, because I'm voicing both of these parts and the exact same microphone and the exact same setup, it's not a huge difference. But if you have two people where, for example, one person is a really quiet speaker and the other person is a very loud speaker, that can be a problem. And that can be hard for an audience to listen to because they may want to turn down the volume for one person and turn it up for the other. So I'm going to go ahead and select both tracks, and don't ask me why this is the case. And if you find an alternate way, I would ask that you share it with me. But the only way to select multiple tracks is to hit select, push down shift on your keyboard, and select. It doesn't work if you just click a track, hit select, and try to click that one as well. I don't know why. Okay, let's go ahead and go to effects, loudness normalization, and when you open up, it'll probably go to set the perceived loudness to -18. There is some discussion around what we should be setting LUFS to on podcasts and the radio. The number I see most often is -19. You don't have to use it, but that is a number that is suggested for a number of reasons, which we won't get into here. Okay, great. Now you see these have just gotten way bigger, so they should sound way louder than they were before. Let's go ahead and take a look at it. You're listening to Where We Meet. I'm Guybek Lorson. Please forgive the voice I'm doing for the secondary character. I'm not very good at it, so. Great. Now we are ready to go ahead and start editing. Let's take a look at what we have here. So the first thing I'm noticing is, first of all, we got a big gap here, and we got some noises that we want to remove. So in Audacity, we can very nicely just go ahead, select that, click and drag, and it'll delete all of that. Some of the things I'm doing here might seem a little fast. That's because I have keyed my mouse some hotkeys, and so I will try to slow down and explain what I'm doing, but sometimes I may forget. In this particular case, what I've done is I clicked and dragged, and then normally you would do... Actually, I don't know how to do this now with the hotkey. I would normally hit the delete key. In this case, I have a delete key keyed to my mouse, so I can edit much faster. So let's go ahead and get the conversation lined up more or less at first, so we don't have this sound. You're listening to Where We Meet. All right, let's make this conversation sound natural, and this is where a bit of guesswork comes into it. You can try to make it easier by making that track start. Let's try that. Let's see how that sounds. You're listening to Where We Meet. I'm Guybek Lorson. And I'm Lorson Guybek. Okay, so I like where these first two things are coming from, but at this point, this feels a little awkward. We can do two things here. We can either select a little bit of space and delete that to see if it brings it closer. Lorson. And I'm Lorson Guybek. Okay, sounds better. I'd probably still delete more, but that's just an example. Another thing you could do here this is how I prefer to edit, is instead of selecting and deleting, I take a selection and I just split the track altogether. Now, the reason why I do that is because I think... Okay. Sorry. In this case, I want to do Control Select to delete that whole bit. I'm used to editing in a different audio program. So let's see how that sounds. I'm Guybek Lorson. And I'm Lorson Gieback. Where we meet is a podcast. Okay. Let's go ahead and delete that. Split it there. I'm Lorson Gieback. Where we meet is a podcast about the intersection of human culture. And today we're covering an interesting one. Okay, great. So we've got this section here which we want to remove. Let's go ahead and do that. How's that sound? Asked about the intersection of human culture. And today... too close together, so let's go ahead and split that and drag it back a bit. The intersection of human culture. And today we're covering an interesting one. Okay, sounds good. Now we can keep going along this path, and we will in just a second, but let's go ahead and add our intro music. Okay, sorry, quick jump cut there. I forgot that I'd closed the file tool, and I had to go back and find where I'd put the Audacity training. So you'll notice here that I have track A and track B, as well as, this will make no sense to you. I work in another podcast whose initials are TT, and this is the intro and outro we use for our bonus episode. So TTBE, bonus episode, intro and outro. For the purposes of audio editing, clear path names, or clear file names are really important. Otherwise, you're just going to lose everything. So I'm going to go ahead and drop our introduction in here, and it's going to create a new track. Now, one thing you may notice in this is that there's a big jump in the decibels here before it levels off and goes down quite a bit here. What I've done to these two tracks, they originally come from one soundtrack. I took off the beginning and the end, so we've got a natural beginning and end point. And then I went ahead and I rolled off, I guess you could say. I faded out the music. So after fading out the music and saving that as an independent file, I'm now able to drop this in here, and instead of having to edit the music every time to make it sound like it's fading out, I've got a pre-used or pre-made bit that I can just drop in and use, ready to go. It saves a lot of time. One of the major things you're going to want to pay attention to in editing is how you can save time in your editing. So let's go ahead and solo this track real quick, and well, let's just listen to it. Let's find a natural point that we want to start our speaking. And what that means is going to be up to you. For my money, I want it to be hitting a beat of some sort, a beat of some note. And if not, just a consistent beat too. If people get used to hearing your voice at a certain point in the introduction song, then you want to keep putting it back at that point. Even if it maybe doesn't fit the exact perfect, I want to be hitting a beat right as I start speaking. The important thing is audience expectations. So if people expect to hear it there, then they're going to feel wronged in some way if it's not. Oops, let me go ahead and bring it back to the beginning. Okay, so as you may have guessed, I intentionally edited this. So right in this moment here when there's that pause, it begins to fade out, as it does for the rest of the track. That is where I personally feel that we should start the music, or start the speaking. So let's go ahead and unsolo that and select these two tracks. And we are going to drag them over here until they roughly align with, I want to start speaking right as we hit this note right here. So let's see how that sounds. You're listening to Where We Meet. I'm Gieback Lorson. And I'm Lorson Gieback. Where We Meet is a podcast about the intersection of human culture. And today we're covering an interesting one. The intersection of the Great Chicago Fire and modern airplane food. It's a really interesting... Cool. All right. So something you may have noticed is it's a bit loud. It's a bit loud here. I personally find it kind of hard to hear the speakers compared to the music. So what we're going to do here is we're going to go ahead and turn this music down a little bit. Let's do it to negative. Let's drop it at 6 dB. Where does that take us? You're listening to Where We Meet. I'm Gieback Lorson. And I'm Lorson Gieback. Where We Meet is a podcast about the intersection of human culture. Okay, that might work. Let me solo it real quickly. For my money, I usually prefer that music be around negative 18 decibels when it's under a speaking part. But again, that's just personal preference. Let me go ahead and solo this and pay attention to this track up here. Okay, it looks like it's hitting about -18. All right, I think that should be fine.
I'm Gibek Lorson.
And I'm Lorson Gibek. Cool. And more or less, we've started down our path of audio editing. It's just the repeat process of making things work. In our case, closing gaps in conversation. It'll be less extreme in normal conversations because you're going to have an actual back and forth instead of me recording one track, then trying to have a fake conversation with myself as I recorded another track. What you're really going to be wanting to account for is if you're recording remotely, there's going to be a bigger gap because of the gap in maybe the call you're using. Modern airplane food.
It's a really interesting story.
Airplane food.
It's a really interesting story, so we hope you stick around.
Cool. So I think after this point, and you can go ahead and delete food. All right. So that's the introduction. This, writ large, is what the audio editing process looks like. It can be a little bit repetitive at times, but that's the job. And the really satisfying thing about being an editor is taking this rough track that sounds okay, good conversation, obviously, it has potential, and then you go in there and you refine it. You add music, you make the conversation sound really natural, and you add some EQing so you can just hear the voices, and it sounds beautiful. It sounds perfect. And that's the really satisfying thing about this work, is that you are the one, when you walk away and listen to that product, you know that, of course, there's something there, but you walked away and you made it something really cool. You made it sound like the final product, and you did create that final product. So it's really satisfying to go through this work. And if you have any questions, of course, you can reference the guide, reference the videos. There's a lot of good resources online, but I'm also always able to answer any questions you have. Okay, thank you for sticking around this long, if indeed you have. Have a great day.